rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. May the blessings and salutations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be amongst every single one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, family, friends, it's an honor to initiate and inaugurate this very wonderful setting that would bring about value and understanding of a very prominent and important topic that we are currently facing. Several ideologies and several perspectives have came into practice, and clarity is of utmost importance. And therefore, when clarity is given, clarity should be required with utmost due right. So what exactly are we talking about? The projected slide in front of every single one of you today shows Darwinism, Islam, and evolution. If we were to simply figure out or define what Darwinism means today, it is the theory of biological evolution that has been founded by the naturalist Charles Darwin. However, when speaking about biology, something is very interesting that brings about all of us together in this very setting. Such a topic with a prominent terminology or terminologies being stated requires a certain speaker to have his thoughts and his perspectives shared so benefit would unravel. I would be humbly announcing our speaker by the following. Mr. Subboor Ahmad is a well-known public speaker and writer who has debated prominent academics on philosophy and science. He has a particular interest in the philosophy of biology, as he's currently pursuing postgraduate studies in philosophy. Mr. Subboor is a speaker for the infamous Hyde Park Speakers Corner with a specialty in the arguments for God's existence. Remarkably speaking, with his interest in biology, especially when it comes to philosophy, and having a topic regarding Darwinism, Islam, and evolution, I would really feel interested to get to know what our speaker tonight has to offer. So having Islam, evolution, and Darwinism in one title requires an empty mind, a listening and attentively listening ear, and by which I would, by all due honor, call upon our speaker for tonight, Mr. Subboor Ahmad.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. This is the greeting of Islam. This is the greetings of Muslims. What I'm going to be speaking about today is I think, very important topic, because the purpose of life according to Islam is not to build big houses, get married and have children and send them off to Harvard, Oxford and Cambridge. It is not to become famous. It is not to become rich. It is not to become the most beautiful person on earth. It is simply to understand that there is a creator that has created us for a purpose. And that purpose is to connect us to that creator. And this purpose is what drives us. And as God says in the Quran, verily in the remembrance of God do hearts find peace. So we as Muslims believe the way to find inner peace is by having a connection with the creator. And the creator is nothing like his creation. He's nothing like what we can imagine. And he's the only one worthy of worship. Why am I talking about that when we are about to speak about this topic of evolution or Darwinian evolution? Is because when you begin to speak about God, one of the first sort of reactions you get is, well, who believes in God after Darwin anyway? We believe in evolution. What I want to do today is clarify that biological evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, as it's understood by mainstream secular academia, is not in any way, shape or form an argument against God or something that undermines the existence of God. Rather, what I'm going to be arguing is that it is a valid scientific theory, and valid scientific theories sometimes conflict with religious scripture, but valid scientific theories are never absolute because science doesn't lead to absolute truth. And so there is not a conflict between Islam and biological evolution, and biological evolution and the existence of God. Now, this is probably the most iconic image of biological evolution, of Darwin's theory of evolution. This is probably more popular than any brand that we know of in the world today. This image is probably something that if you went to a village in Africa and you showed this image in a school, they would recognize this as evolution. If you go to South America, you go to some far off village close to the Amazon, and you again go to some sort of school or some sort of facility, you show them this image, they'll say, yes, we've seen this before. How many of you, raise your hands, have seen this image before? Wow, pretty much everyone. I'm sorry to inform you that this image is actually completely wrong. This image is not the way that biological evolution works. This image is not the way that Darwin's theory of evolution works. So let me just repeat that. All of us here have seen this image. Everyone across the world understands that this is the iconic image of biological evolution. Yet, this image is completely false according to mainstream secular biologists and philosophers of biology and philosophers of science. Not because of any religious reasons, simply because this is not the way that biological evolution works. Now, why this image is false is something I'm going to go into later on, inshallah, God willing. But what I do want to cover is this. Something that you believe to be correct, and most of the people on earth believe to be correct, or the way that biological evolution works, is not the way it actually works. And the reason for that is there is a difference between the public understanding of biological evolution, which is what we have, and the academic understanding. And the public understanding is the biological theory of evolution is a challenge to God. The biological theory of evolution works in this way. The biological theory of evolution is true. And from an academic perspective, from a secular mainstream academic perspective, this is not the way it works. It doesn't claim absolute certainty, and it doesn't undermine God. So you guys can all go home now. But if you want to stay, I'd appreciate it. If you want to stay awake, I'll also appreciate that, although I do understand you've had a long day. What I would also appreciate is if you look at everything I'm saying with a skeptical mind. I want you to imagine that everything I'm saying, you want to challenge, you want to question. Because the best thing that you could do as students is not just simply accept what you're taught, but question and see, right, is this guy, does he actually know what he's talking about? Is it the wrong speaker? Did he just make this up? Where did he get this from? So everything I say today, I'm saying from a perspective of secular mainstream academia, that this is what they are saying about biological evolution. Now, everything I'm going to say about Islam is what you get from mainstream Islamic sources. So the question I would love today is someone saying, you're wrong because I don't think that's true, because I don't think you have any evidence for that. I would love that question, because then I would be able to inform you where I actually got that from. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through this presentation. It's going to take roughly about 45 minutes. And after this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to have a Q&A. Now, most of the learning actually happens in the Q&A. So I understand you're going to find it a bit difficult. Sometimes you might hear a term and you're going to be like, what the heck is that? And is that some sort of octopus or something, right? So when you hear things, when you hear certain terms and you don't understand them, don't worry, just write it down. Because I've been asked to speak about a very comprehensive topic in a very short period of time, I'm going to be going through it in a very brief way. And you guys might follow along some points, not follow along other points, but those are the sort of things we can iron out during the Q&A. Okay, clicker seems to have stopped working. Nope, it's working. So what we're going to be covering is some basic points today. We're going to speak about science and certainty. Does science lead to truth? Does it lead to certainty in the way that the public thinks? We're going to look at the current state of Darwinian evolution as it's understood by secular mainstream academics. We're going to briefly speak about the existence of God and Darwinian evolution, although that is something which is going to be it's going to overlap a little bit with Wednesday's talk. Why Darwinian evolution is unique in the history of science, why it's not like any other theory in the history of science, in a not so good way, and a little bit about Islam and science, Islam and scientific conclusions. So, as I mentioned before, every single thing I'm going to say today is not based on intelligent design or creationism. It's going to be from mainstream secular academics who are naturalists, and I'm going to be referring to mainstream journals about the topics I'm speaking about. So what is science? Science is something which we all benefit from. Science is a beautiful method. It actually came from the Islamic world. The first scientist was Hassan ibn Haytham, who was a Quranic scholar who lived in Baghdad approximately 1,000 years ago. He is the key figure who science historians go back to because he is the father of the modern scientific method. The Greeks had a sort of proto-scientific method, but they didn't have a systematic way of looking at the world. Now, when Hassan ibn Haytham was doing science, when he was doing these calculations, when he was putting together his method and his conclusions, he said that he was doing this, he was pursuing science because he wanted to get closer to God. Because we as Muslims believe that the world, the biological world, the physical world, the chemical world is all a sign of the divine. It is all something which reminds you of the Creator. So that was something which was actually driving him. Now his systematic approach was basically the following, and it's pretty much the same method that we use today, although we may use different technical terms like falsification and scientific holism and all this sort of stuff, but essentially it's the same method. Now what was the method? The method is you start off with a question, you go out and you get some observations, and after you get some observations you come up with a theory, and based upon, you come up with a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis against observations, you repeatedly test that hypothesis again and again and again, and if it seems to be working over a long period of time, and there seems to be giving you results which are useful, then that scientific hypothesis becomes into a scientific theory. The theory, a scientific theory, is the highest thing that you can actually reach. There is, this misconception. Oh, you see, scientific theories are down here and scientific laws and facts are up there. That's actually not true. Scientific theory is the highest level of certainty that science can actually reach. Scientific laws are within the theories, and scientific laws can also change, which is a bit, counterintuitive. And also scientific facts are not the facts that we speak about in daily life, like the shape of the earth. Facts are a generally accepted view within science. So that's the scientific method. Why do we love science? Because it works, because we have iPhones, because we have cameras, because we can manage to, do all these amazing revision on our laptops and phones and so on and so forth, and also manage to have Facebook open during a lecture about evolution. We can do all these things without the other people actually knowing. Now, science, we love it because it actually works. And you can see here, you have a picture of Isaac Newton, and he's doing his amazing calculations, and the Newtonian model is something which worked for 200 years. We could make a precise prediction. Where is this planet going to be in 10 years' time? And we could do some calculations and say, okay, it's going to be here. And we would go out after 10 years, we'd wait 10 years, we'd look, and voila, it would be there. So science, it works, which is why we believe it's amazing. Now the problem is not that that science works. The problem is we don't understand why it works, and we conflate it working with it being true. we conflate science and truth, rationality and science. We conflate all these terms, but they mean very particular things. So, how does science actually work? Science works on a method known as induction, which is where you take a set of observations and you make a general conclusion. So, I want to know what color swans are, and I'm a scientist. So I observe white swans, white swans, white swans, white swans, and I come up with a general hypothesis. Swans are white. I observe more swans, and it just becomes into a theory because it just keeps coming back and back and back and back with the same result. The problem is, in the future, I can come across a black swan, and my previous theory is then challenged. The problem here is that the problem of induction, as it's known, as it was pointed out by the philosopher David Hume many centuries ago, is something of a general problem in what's known as epistemology, the theory of knowledge, but is a particular problem in science, because when science works, we automatically start to think it leads to conclusions which are true in the literal sense, and that is problematic. Now, someone may be objecting in the audience somewhere like, hang on a minute, that is a really simplistic understanding of the scientific method. Because scientific theories have multiple assumptions, they have multiple layers of constants or whatever things we want to put in there, assumptions, axioms, whatever. I've only simplified it to this level to show you that from a bare skeleton point of view, we're dealing with something which can change at a fundamental level. So any level higher than that, it can also change. Another reason why scientific conclusions can change is what's known as the problem of undetermination of theory by observation. That's the technical term, but what it basically means is we have this scatter graph, we have this set of observations, those green dots. Those green dots, if you imagine, are direct observations. They're not theories. They're things that we observe, like the shape of the earth or the shape of a particular molecule or whatever. So those are things that don't change. They're observations, right? Now, based upon those observations, if I was to give you guys a pen and ask you, okay, can you please draw a line of best fit? Some people are going to draw a straight line. Some people are going to draw like a curve. Some people are going to draw like an exponential curve. Some people are going to draw smiley faces. You could do a whole bunch of things with the same evidence. This is known as the scatter graph problem, or the problem of theory undetermination of theory by observation. That's the technical term in the philosophy of science. So because of these two reasons, scientific conclusions are not absolute. Scientific facts, as they're known, are not absolute. They are something which can change due to these two particular issues. Now, someone may say, this is a challenge to science. Well, it is, but this is what makes the scientific method beautiful. Because you can have theories which exist for a long time, which work and then can be changed. So it goes through this constant evolution, which is actually a good thing. Imagine how boring it would be if scientific conclusions never actually changed. So this is not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. Of course, what doesn't change is direct observations. Another misconception is that observations is the same as a scientific theory. No, science leads to truth. Why? Because we know that fossils exist, or we know that the shape of the earth is there. Well, this is a conflation between observations and theory. These observations, you don't need to be a scientist to make these observations. These are purely simple observations. Using observations, you can come up with astrology, which is of course not science, or you can come up with astronomy, which is science. So these things on their own are not absolute. They're not the same as theory. Observations are true. They don't change. They are there. But the scientific theories and hypotheses that are based upon them do change. This particular issue is subtle, but it's fundamental to understanding that science doesn't lead to certainty. So science is way more than observations. You have an entire method which works in a particular way. Now, as I mentioned before, Einstein Newton had his amazing model of the universe. It worked well for 200 years. Einstein came along and showed, actually, do you know what? This particular model of the universe, although it worked for 200 years, although it made precise predictions which actually came true, this particular model of the universe is not correct. And what did he do? He came along 250 years after Newton, and he basically argued that we have fundamental misunderstandings about the way the universe works. So what he said is that gravity is no longer a pulling force, it is a pushing force due to space-time curvature. So he flipped it on his head. He changed the very definition of mass. Now, think about how radical that actually is. Imagine, you are a pre-Einsteinian physicist and you are actually working on some particular problem, like here. And Einstein comes along and says, although your formulas have worked well for 250 years or 200 so years, your very definition of mass is incorrect. And that's what he fundamentally argued for. And that space and time are not fixed, which was an assumption of the Newtonian model. Rather, he said, space and time is like fabric, it's like cloth, it's constantly changing, it's dynamic. So again, fundamental challenges to the Newtonian worldview. Now, many of the physicists were upset. They're like, this is a crazy idea, but today, as we know, it's completely accepted by all physicists, that this is our understanding of the physical universe. So, something that worked for 200 and above 200 years turned out to be not true in the literal sense, because new data came which challenged it. New interpretations came which challenged it. So what we should understand is that this is the history of science. If you look at the history of science from chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, medicine, we have complete changes, radical paradigms from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 350 years ago, radical changes in every single field in science over a long period of time. You'll have to see that. Now, theories work even when they're wrong. So, even after it was shown that the Newtonian model of the universe is incorrect, we applied it to apparently the moon landing. Some people believe it didn't happen. I'm not going to get into that, but let's just assume it did. We went to the moon based upon the Newtonian model of the universe, although that is not true from the Einsteinian perspective. So something can work even though it's not true. Now, this particular car, I know absolutely nothing about cars, but I know this is a blue car. Now, this blue car has these nitrogen boosters. Nitrogen boosters can help your car go very fast. You can get to the lecture on time. Now, these nitrogen boosters, imagine there is a guy with a cigarette in his mouth and he's chilling out with music playing, and I go and knock on his window when he's actually sitting in this car, and I say to him, hey buddy, you've got a really nice car here and it's fantastic, and I can see you're going really, really fast and you've got all these gadgets and stuff in your car. Just wanted to inform you about something very interesting. You see, nitrogen, which is being used to make your car go really, really fast, this nitrogen was discovered using a chemical theory known as phlogiston. And this chemical theory of phlogiston today is not accepted by anyone. It actually turned out to be completely false. So a false scientific theory helped discover nitrogen, which is an observation, which is true. Now obviously that guy is going to be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I don't know. And I walk away. But you guys understand. That's the main point. It's going to stick in your head and you are going to understand. So scientific theories work even when they are shown to be false. Here's a really interesting one. Anyone study physics here? 1, 2, 3. Wow. We have some intelligent people in this room. I hope you guys don't study something like fashion design, which is what my wife did, and I just think it's not even a subject worth pursuing. But we have physics, a real degree, something worth paying tuition fees for, something worth getting up in the morning for, something objective, not subjective and trivial. So, theories work even when they contradict each other. This is very important. Theories work even when they contradict each other. In physics, we have Einsteinian general relativity and we have quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics and general relativity aren't exactly best friends because at a fundamental level they disagree. They cannot both be literally true. Now, these are two scientific theories which are accepted by physicists, although at a fundamental level they both can't be true. So scientific theories work, make predictions which are shown to be true even though they can fundamentally conflict with each other. Right, so this is the way that science actually works, and this is the paradigm shift that we actually need to go through. Now, this is what it says in Philosophy of Science, a very short introduction by Oxford University. I thought it would be good to put references down and to show you that this sort of information about the way that science works is not even based upon really academic stuff from the philosophy of science. This is like a very basic introduction to the philosophy of science, something which is for the general public if they want to know. This is what it says. Historically, we have many cases of scientific theories which were successful but which turned out to be false. And if you're wondering who this handsome guy is, this is Larry Loudon. He is a philosopher of science and he's put together a philosophical paper of really powerful scientific theories which really worked, which turned out to be false. I didn't just put him there because of a pretty face. So, all scientific theories change, and this is something which is accepted by philosophers of science. This is not something which is controversial. This is what it says in Evidence and Evolution by Cambridge University Press, again a standard book on the philosophy of biology, which is a particular subset of philosophy of science. The best that scientists can do at any time is to render comparative judgments. They can say this theory is better than that theory, but they cannot say that this is literally true. So, likewise, Philosophy of Science, a new introduction, says the same thing. Scientific conclusions are not graven in stone, and we shouldn't be using the word scientific proof, which is what we use all the time. We shouldn't actually be using that. Also, Richard Dawkins, in his famous, actually not so famous book, but in his book A Devil's Chaplain, he makes the same point. He says, new facts may come to light in the 21st century which will force our successors. What does he say? We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. So that's important to understand. Now here he's referring to Darwinism. Darwinism is different to evolution. Darwinism is a particular type of evolution. Evolution was known before Darwin. It's been known for thousands of years. It simply means biological change over time. It's not theologically corrosive. It just means biological change over time. Darwin came along and proposed two ideas. He said all of life, you, me, everybody, elephants, tigers, Lady Gaga, unfortunately have a common ancestor. Yes, you are related to Lady Gaga. Now, because of that idea of universal common ancestry, he had to propose a mechanism, how the change happened, and he proposed a mechanism known as natural selection. Evolution simply means biological change over time, but Darwinian evolution is a theory. This is an observation, and this is a theory based upon two particular ideas. Right, imagine you are attending a lecture and you have somebody talking about biological evolution, and this person is saying, right, Darwin's theory of evolution is true. It is as true as the shape of the earth. It is as true as anything we know. And he claims that whether you look at biochemistry or genetics or anatomy or psychology or linguistics or biochemistry or bioinformatics or whatever, you will come across one conclusion, which is all of these fields prove that Darwin's theory of evolution is true. At that point, you can say three things, right? No evolutionary biologist in the world, whether he supports Darwinian evolution or supports an alternative to Darwinian evolution, will deny something basic, which is Darwin's theory is based on a probabilistic framework. No one can deny that. It has multiple assumptions. No one's going to deny that. And there are disputes at a scientific and philosophical, conceptual level about its particular claims. No one in the world who knows what they're talking about will deny these three things. Sometimes they may not even know them themselves, sadly, in which case you'll have to point that out. But this is something that no evolutionary biologist in the world will deny. Now, sometimes you hear these popular things, popular notions like 99% of evolutionary biologists believe in Darwinian evolution. Right. Yes, they do, but when they say believe, they believe it to be a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, which has disputes. They don't believe it to be absolutely true, because that's not what science can achieve. And if there is somebody who does actually believe that, then they would have to put forth some evidence, because nobody in the philosophy of science and nobody who's involved within secular mainstream academia, whether they're an evolutionary biologist or not, can deny that Darwinian evolution is based, it has these three components. This is just simply undeniable. Evolution and Darwinism, I explained previously. Evolution simply means biological change over time. Darwin's theory is a particular history and a particular mechanism. Now, people before Darwin, they had different histories. Rather than a universal common ancestry, they had multiple origins. They had many origins, and they had many trees of parallel evolution actually taking place. Now, if I gave you Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and I gave you this book and it only had 13 randomly selected pages which had some writing, and all of the rest of the pages were blank, and I asked you, please can you carry on telling the story? How does it begin? How does it end? Which characters come in? Which characters go out? Who gets murdered? Who's the murderer? Who cheats on who? What happens? You will all come up with different stories. Why is that? It's because majority of the pages are blank and 13 pages are there. So you have a very little piece of very little evidence to go by, and you have to make up the rest. This analogy is actually in a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Science, which is the second most prestigious scientific journal in the world. And what it basically says is working out the history of life on Earth is kind of like working out the plot of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace with only 13 randomly selected pages. That's how difficult it actually is. Another way to actually put it is this. It's not just a scattergraph, it's a scattergraph on steroids. Why is that? It's that way because according to current estimates, 99, and I want you to remember this number, 99.999. Keep that in mind. 99.999% of species, not organisms, species, have never been observed. We don't have their fossils, we don't have their DNA, we have no cave scratching, chicken scratching type drawings of them, we have nothing. 99.999% of species. So that analogy of Leo Tolstoy's book is relevant here, because 99.999% of species are actually missing. So somebody can look at the history of life and come up with universal common ancestry or multiple origins like Lamarck did before Darwin, the web of life, the tree of life, the net of life, bush of life. You can come up with gradualism or rapid change, progression or non-progression. Whatever you make is bound to be probabilistic at best. One of the ways that Richard Lewontin, he's an atheist evolutionary biologist at Harvard, explains this is that when you're watching a documentary or watching a particular program, or you read this in an evolutionary textbook, how does the trait of having a big brain evolve? Well, what happened is when we came down from the trees and we were slowly learning to become bipedal, then we just thought, hey, what do I do with these things? Hey, let me cook. And then we started cooking and we grew bigger brains. That is a scientific theory, a scientific hypothesis, which sounds plausible. But what Richard Lewontin says, and this is obviously something that's made up about all of these sort of traits that we actually have, there's an evolutionary history to it. he says we need to be careful because these are or can be just so stories. Now, what are just so stories? Rudyard Kipling, in his famous children's book, he goes over just so stories. So how did the elephant get its long trunk? Well, the elephant was enjoying, it was chilling out somewhere, and this crocodile decided to bite its trunk and to try and drag it into the water, and as the elephant is resisting, it gets longer and longer and longer. So these are just so stories. This obviously, just so story, this term was, it's maybe 100 years old or whatever, but Richard Lewontin used that a couple of decades ago as an example to show that when we have these evolutionary scenarios that this trait evolved in this way, this particular thing evolved this way, he's basically saying, well, how do you know? This is how different is this to a just so story? There's an interesting example of a just so story pointed out by Raymond Tallis. So he's an atheist neuroscientist, but he points out some of these just so stories. So one of the just so stories that he points out is about color evolution or color preference. Now you may be wondering, hang on a second, why are they talking about color preference? What's that got to do? Well, what you need to understand is that Darwinian evolution is a complete explanation, meaning every single thing that you have as a human being, whether it's your biochemical connections, whether it's your neural network, whether it's your behavior, your linguistics, or generally even the way that human beings are scattered across Earth and why are they scattered in that way, every single thing has to break down and be explained via Darwinian evolution. So they have to come up with some sort of explanation for those things. So some of the explanations that they come up with are some things which we are aware of and which we are taught in documentaries and so on and so forth, but which actually turn out to be quite interesting. So Raymond Tallis points out color evolution. So men like the color blue, women like the color red. So it goes. So what basically happened according to this hypothesis is that when human beings lived in ancient prehistoric times, when we were living in times of hunter-gatherer societies, you had men who, if they had a mutation in their gene, a random mutation, which made them prefer the color blue, they were more likely to survive, because when they had to go out and hunt, if the sky was blue and they liked it, they were more likely to go out and hunt, and the watering hole is blue, and so on and so forth. So they liked the color blue. And unfortunately for the feminists in the room, the hypothesis goes the women were in the bushes, they were cooking, and that's what they were doing. And since they were cooking, they were cutting meat, which is red. If it's not gone off, it's red. They were collecting berries, which are red. They were collecting apples, which are red. So we have a very nice anti-feminist understanding of the evolution of human history. So what basically happened is, obviously those women who developed a random mutation to love the color red were more likely to survive, because if they cooked on time and made everything, they wouldn't get clubbed by their husbands. So we have this amazing evolutionary explanation. However, Raymond Tallis comes in and spoils the party. He says, hang on guys, this evolutionary scenario is problematic, because men liking the color blue and women liking the color red is a very Eurocentric view at a particular time in history. During Victorian times, men preferred the color red and women preferred the color blue, hence Alice in Wonderland in blue. So this particular hypothesis doesn't actually make sense. This particular theory doesn't make sense. It's a just so story. So this is a sort of example of a just so story, which is a, if you like, a micro example of the sort of just so stories which we are fed. Now, we also get this very simplistic understanding about evolution. We are told, right, you see a human being and you take a chimpanzee next to it, right? Look at how the elbows are similar, look how the wrists are similar, look at how this particular part of the skull is similar, look at how this is similar, look at how that is similar. Oh wow, look at the genes, it's like 99% similar as well. So similarity is due to common descent. You're similar to the chimpanzee because of common descent. And that's generally, in a nice, neat package form, was fed to the general public, which is me and you. However, there's a background to that which is very interesting, which will show us that actually that claim is not true in the literal sense. It's simply not. Firstly, that assumption is the assumption of homology, that similarities are due to common descent. That's not something that can be proven. It is simply an assumption. The assumption is similarities are due to common descent. Now, if somebody claims that similarities are due to common descent, similarities exist, oh look at this, and therefore similarities are due to common descent, as you would know if you've done a basic class in philosophy or logic, that is a circular argument. Similarities are due to common descent, that's an assumption. Similarities exist, therefore similarities are due to common descent. That is circular reasoning. Apart from that, if somebody wants to say similarities between human beings and chimpanzees is something I believe in based upon the assumption that similarities are due to common descent, well, there'd be no problem with that. But that's not the claim that is often portrayed, how do you say the word? Portrayed to the public. Tongue twister. Right. So, the problem along with that claim is also that we have similarities which is not due to common descent. We have similarities all over the biosphere which is not due to common descent. For example, we have the wing of a bird and the wing of a bat. We have these two wings. Now, both of these wings, they are used in a similar way, they have a similar function, but that is not due to common ancestry. That's what's known as homoplasy, the opposite of homology, which is similarities which is not due to common descent. Likewise, we have the genes for echolocation in a bat and the genes for echolocation in a dolphin, a whale, and these are not due to common descent. These are an example of homoplasy. Homoplasy exists at a biochemical, genetic, and anatomical level. It is inescapable. So this claim, wow, look, similarity, look, this thing's similar to that, so therefore they have a common ancestor. This is a very childish, crude understanding, because you could just simply ask, wait, hang on a second, you're saying 99% between human beings and chimpanzees. Well, okay, we have 98% similarity genetically with mice. That's when you're going to get either a confused look, or you're going to get someone saying, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. And you'll say, aha, that's the whole point. There's a whole history behind this. It's not as simple as that. Now, homology, homoplasy, this is a quagmire, and it's not the guy from Family Guy. It's a big, big problem, and this is the problem, as explained by Elliot Sober, a prominent philosopher of science, a philosopher of biology. He says, both of the following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, whether genetically or anatomically. And he does make that clear previously to this as well. And humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they're so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. And that's exactly what is the understanding of mainstream secular academics. It's not as simple as, ooh, look, similarity, ooh, look, similarity, ooh, look, common ancestor, oh, look, the fire exit. That's what you should say to someone like that, because they clearly don't know what they're talking about. So, we have a human being there. That's what you actually look like without clothes and skin. Yeah, it's very pretty, isn't it? So you have this human being. Now, within the human being, there may be similarities between human beings and chimps. However, there are similarities between human beings and other creatures which are much according to even the evolutionary tree, the Darwinian tree, much further than us, which is an example of homoplasy, not an example of homology. So for example, chimps live in communities of up to 100. They don't live in communities bigger than that. Ants are the closest thing to human beings in nature. You have ants in a colony that live in mega cities, which live in numbers of millions, which have warfare, slavery, economics. You know, we have all this complex social interaction which human beings actually have. Likewise, we have similarity between our linguistic capabilities and those of songbirds, something which we do not have with chimpanzees. So we have similarities between ourselves and ants, which don't exist between ourselves and chimps. Similarities between ourselves and ourselves and birds, which don't exist between ourselves and chimps. Likewise, we have similarities, and I should have put a picture of a pig up there, but you know, it's getting kind of busy. We have similarities anatomically and genetically between ourselves and pigs, and we have some particular similarities between ourselves and pigs which we do not share with chimpanzees. So for example, before we had the way of making mass insulin for people who have diabetes, we used to extract the insulin from pigs and stick it in human beings to work. Likewise, people that suffer from heart disease and heart problems, you can have a heart valve replacement between a human being and a pig, which you cannot have between a human being and a chimpanzee. Likewise, there's a whole host of traits which exist between human beings and pigs, which don't exist between human beings and chimps. There's multiple assumptions within the Darwinian worldview, within the Darwinian theory. These assumptions are gradualism, natural selection, random mutations. You have single origin, tree of life. Neo-Darwinism is claiming that acquired characteristics are not inherited. These are all some of the assumptions of Neo-Darwinism. This is not something which is undeniable. Dennis Noble, a prominent biologist from Oxford University, again a mainstream secular academic, he claims that all the central assumptions of Neo-Darwinism have been disproven. I'm not saying what he's saying is true. Why I put that out there is to show, although he may believe in a different conception of a different mechanism than Darwinian evolution, although he still believes in evolution, he's pointing out there are assumptions and these assumptions can be disproven. I'm not endorsing his opinion, I'm merely showing that it exists. And his opinion is a fringe opinion. But it's nonetheless something which teaches us that there are assumptions involved. Now, there are alternatives to Darwinian evolution. There's evolution by natural genetic engineering, neo-Lamarckian evolution, mutation-driven evolution, evolution by self-organization, and the inheritance of acquired genomes, as put forth by Lynn Margulis. We also have this project called the Third Way of Evolution, which is a whole bunch of scientists. Again, they are fringe, but they're mainstream secular biologists who don't feel mainstream academia is open enough to accept these ideas, and they exist from all across the world, from China to North America to Europe, from Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, Princeton, MIT, and they basically are putting forth alternatives to Darwinian evolution. Now, a thing which is interesting, which we're going to cover on Wednesday's talk in a lot more detail, is that Darwinian evolution is based upon methodological naturalism, which is the idea that everything has to be explained in a naturalistic way. And if you happen to be someone who's an atheist, it happens to fit with your worldview quite nicely, which is why we have a bias towards this particular theory. One interesting thing is that from the view of methodological naturalism, you cannot say that human beings appeared in the history of life without being linked to something else. We have to have a common ancestor by necessity, logical necessity, not due to observations, but simply because of the assumption of methodological naturalism. So we have to be linked to a chimpanzee, a pig, or whatever. We have to be linked to something. It cannot just be that human beings appeared in the history of life without being linked to something else. Darwinian evolution, as I mentioned, is unique. It's unique in the sense that it's the only scientific theory in the history of the world which morphed from a valid scientific theory into a political, ethical, and religious system. Let me repeat that. It is unique because it's the only scientific theory which turned from a valid scientific theory into a religious, political, and ethical system. Now you may be wondering, how did it become into a religious system? Question for the Q&A. Actually, no, not for the Q&A. I forgot this slide was there. You can see, I'll blame jet lag rather than incompetence. So it's good old jet lag. That's what it is. So, why is it a religious system? Well, firstly, religion can mean much more than just belief in God. So, for example, Buddhism is a religion, although many Buddhists don't believe in God. Here's a man, Richard Michael Roos. He is a philosopher of science, he is an atheist, and he published a book by Oxford University about a year and a half ago called Darwinism as Religion. And what he claims is, from the very beginning, Darwinian evolution, because it fitted with an atheistic worldview, it morphed into an atheistic type of religion, an atheistic type of worldview. Another man, this handsome guy on my right, Julian Huxley, very important evolutionary biologist and philosopher, again a militant atheist. In his 1927 book, some of you weren't born at that time, 1927 book, what's the name of the book again? 1927 book, something, I've forgotten the name. So Julian Huxley wrote a book, Religion Without Revelation. There you go, I remembered it. Religion Without Revelation. What he basically says in this book is that we have this new religion which exists for humanity, for me and you, without revelation, meaning we didn't need God for this religion. This is a secular religion. And this secular religion, he believed, was evolutionary humanism. That you can live a life without God, you can derive your morality from evolution, and so on and so forth. And he was explicit about this. Now, he's not just some quack working away in his mum's basement. He was a very important evolutionary biologist. In fact, he's one of the key figures in evolutionary biology in the beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, he was the first president of the United Nations Scientific, Educational, Cultural Organization, UNESCO. He was the first president of that. What that basically means is he had a very powerful position in terms of education to influence all of you. And he held these views that God, he compared God to a cat. He believed in militant atheism. He believed that people should not believe in God, and that in the future people will not believe in God in the same way that people don't believe the earth is flat. So he was a militant atheist who helped spearhead this religious movement of Darwinian evolution. And a very popular book called The Blind Watchmaker from the 1980s, Richard Dawkins, another prominent atheist, he says something very interesting. He says Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Now you can start to see there's something wrong with that statement. Firstly, it's not a scientific statement. Two, if you know anything about Darwin, you would know he was never an intellectually satisfied atheist. He was never happy with atheism. Three, you would know, hang on a second, if somebody has a belief in a scientific theory, which he believes supports his worldview, that's going to make him biased towards that particular theory. And that's exactly what's actually happening. Darwinian evolution as an ethical system, beginning of the 20th century, we had these movements which took this scientific theory and they wanted to show that we can actually derive our morals and our ethics from them. This particular picture shows 12 types of if you like, humanoids, if you like. So at the bottom, we have 6 types of clear apes, and at the top we have a subset of apes, which we're supposed to be humans. And by a complete coincidence, amazing coincidence, number one happens to be the Caucasian race. Number two is a little bit Chinese. Number three is a little bit hippie-ish. Number four, we're getting slightly African. Number five, we're getting full African. Number six, we're getting very dark African. Number seven is an ape. So the difference between step number 6 and step number 7 is 1, and the difference between the Caucasian number 1 and number 6 is 5 steps. Right. This is not a made up diagram. This is actually from an evolutionary textbook written by Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Darwin. Darwin reviewed his book and gave it the thumbs up and said, if this guy wrote his book before I published my Descent of Man, I wouldn't have published my book. So no scientific theory in the history of science has had these sort of ethical implications. Now today, interestingly enough, you will find nobody talking about this. The reason why they will not talk about this is because of World War II and what actually happened with Nazi Germany and the shifting moral compass that we do not accept racism like we used to in the good old days of the Victorians. So, what you will find is that evolutionary biologists who know the history will shy away from this, or they will try to change it in a way that they'll try and make all human beings on the same level, because that's what's politically popular at the moment. But what cannot be denied is that if human evolution from a Darwinian perspective is true, some humans have to be better than others. That's just simply undeniable. Darwinian evolution also has a political system. Stalin adopted Darwinism. He apparently, according to his biographer, read The Origin of Species, and he became an atheist because of reading The Origin of Species, and he also applied natural selection, Darwin's theory, to social class, which is what led to the deaths of some millions of people. No scientific theory in the history of the world has had that sort of impact, in a very negative sense, of course. Lastly, last slide about Islam, evolution and Darwinism. As it was previously mentioned, Darwin's theory, when it's understood in the way that it's understood, not by popularizers, not by the general public, but by secular academia, it is something which is based on a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, which has disputes. It doesn't undermine the existence of God. It doesn't claim absolute certainty. So it is not a problem for Islam, and it's not a problem for Abrahamic religions. It is a problem if someone has a misunderstanding about science and misunderstanding about its conclusions, but we as Muslims, we can accept it as a valid scientific theory, but we don't have to accept it as literally true, because no one is making that claim within secular academia. Just because a scientific theory conflicts with the Quran, with the Book of the Muslims, doesn't mean that the Book of the Muslims is incorrect. It simply means a scientific theory conflicts with that. So at the beginning of the 20th century, actually mid-20th century, all physicists believed in the static state model. They believed the universe is eternal, it always exists, it always will exist. Now the problem for religious folk at that time was that if this theory was true in the literal sense, you would not need God, because the universe simply always existed. Now the problem here was that this scientific theory is something which later was shown to be wrong, and it was replaced by the Big Bang model. Now the Big Bang model is more in line with religious belief, because the universe actually has a beginning. In 100 years from now, there may be another type of model of the universe, which is a static state model. Now the problem is, imagine if you're a Muslim scientist or a Christian or a Jewish or a religious scientist in 1950s, and you have this scientific theory which challenges your personal belief. You have two choices. One, what you can do is you can change your religious belief and say, no, the universe has always existed, and maybe God existed with the universe, or some other blasphemous thing like that. Or what you can say is, well, this is a valid scientific theory, but it's not absolutely true. I'm going to accept it as a valid scientific theory. I'm going to accept it as a working model, and I'm going to work within this field. I'm just not going to accept it to be absolutely true, which is exactly the right approach, and which is the actual approach which Muslims, Christians, and Jews and other religious people should actually be doing with Darwin's theory of evolution. They should simply be saying, look, we're going to accept this as a valid scientific theory, model, paradigm, but we're not going to accept it to be absolutely true because it doesn't make that claim. Lastly, what I'd like to end upon is this. I began off with the purpose of life. I began off with the existence of God. In Islam, we believe the reason why we exist is to worship the Creator, to have a connection with the Creator, and it's through this connection that we will find serenity, tranquility, peace. However, what we also believe is that nature itself is a signpost to God. And studying nature should bring us closer to God rather than bringing us further away. So studying the biological world should actually make you much more closer to God. Studying nature should make you a better worshipper of God, as Hassan ibn Haytham was, and he is someone who clearly understood that nature is something which we should study in order to get closer to the divine. As it says in the Quran, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of night and day, there are signs for those with intelligence. Everything good I have said is from Allah, our Creator. Every mistake is my own. I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.